doesn't love a good mystery? There's this limited TV series on one of the streaming networks, Hulu. The show is called A Murder at the End of the World, and it's a classic murder mystery in the Agatha Christie tradition. Like her Murder on the Orient Express, A Murder at the End of the World features a locked room, more or less. In this case, it's a hotel in Iceland, where the guests, ostensibly on a business retreat, have voluntarily surrendered their cell phones. That's never a good sign, as one by one, the hotel guests are turning up dead. Someone in the hotel is killing them. Who? On the retreat is a young hero, a Gen Z sleuth, a woman who has published a book about her efforts to find a serial killer in the Midwest of the United States. Can she identify the killer in Iceland before it's too late? I mention this show because of the way it effortlessly blends hacking in with normal things. Call it casual hacking. For example, the hero, Darby Hart, needs to see surveillance video from the night of the first murder. The cameras in the resort are all on a protected network, and of course she doesn't have access. Yet it's the same network that the smart lighting in the conference room and throughout the facility is on. So she takes one of the smart bulbs and uses the circuit board from that to access the private network. Okay, that's a bit simplistic, but I admire how all this is done without the usual this and that explained first. No, she just knows how to gain access to figure out who's murdering them, and then does it. They're real-life people like Darby. Maybe they're not solving murders. Maybe they're called to do forensics, and not necessarily on traditional enterprise network systems. No, they're doing forensics on devices that we rely upon for our critical infrastructure. And what's amazing is that often they require an enormous amount of experience and expertise, both in the real world and in the cyber. This is the story of one woman who often gets called in the middle of the night to keep our lights on and water flowing. And that's a good thing for all of us, that she exists in real life. I'm Robert Vamosi. This is Error Code.
Hi, I'm Lesley Carthart, Technical Director of Incident Response at Dragos. And Dragos is an industrial cybersecurity company. We focus on products and services for the non-standard part of cybersecurity. That means things like SCADA and industrial control systems, critical infrastructure instead of normal enterprise computing.
If you haven't heard of Lesley Carthart, aka Hacks for Pancakes, then you're in for a real treat. I've been a fan of hers for years, and I'm happy to say that she's just as sincere and genuine in person as she presents herself in presentations and panels. We met on the first day of the RSA conference in San Francisco. She's got the depth and range of experience that one can only envy, and that's good, because she's focused on non-standard parts of cybersecurity. I asked her to explain that a bit more.
So there's this whole swath of computers around us every day that we don't think about a lot. We're used to thinking about computers as desktop PCs and laptops and maybe our mobile devices. But really, so many parts of our modern infrastructure, from water to power to trains to cars to medical devices, are all running on lots and lots of computers. And those industrial computers, we don't notice them until they're not working. We notice them when there's a failure, when the power goes out, when there's a problem with our infrastructure, when transportation's delayed. The rest of the time, we don't think about them being there, but they're computers, and they are vulnerable to all of the cybersecurity issues that our typical laptops and desktops are as well.
So when Lesley says that they're vulnerable as our laptops and desktops are, there's a different technology that's often used with OT. It's not necessarily using an operating system, for example. And in legacy devices, there are not necessarily the resources to tap into. So how do you go about doing that?
So it's a mix. There's been something over the last couple decades called IT-OT convergence. And what that is a more prevalent base of familiar operating systems like Windows and familiar network technologies like Cisco and Juniper in those spaces because they're cheap. Because you can go buy those things off the shelf and you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So yes, in legacy technology, there's a lot of custom firmware. There's a lot of non-standard operating systems, legacy NICS-based systems running these industrial technologies, these ruggedized computers. But in modern industrial computing, there's a lot of devices that do very, very critical things that are running things like Windows Embedded. Because again, it's cheap and easy to replace and easy to purchase.
So we all know about the network attack surface, and we talk a lot about that in the network threat space. The OT threat base hasn't really been talked much about, and that's kind of why this podcast exists, to talk to the experts like Lesley who surface some of the issues that OT and IoT experience. Let's start with a baseline. What is the background noise typically like with an OT environment?
I break the cases that I respond to into 3 general buckets. The first bucket is commodity, and because there's so many Windows systems that exist in these industrial environments, they are vulnerable to things like ransomware. And it can cause a big impact. It doesn't necessarily impact the low-level devices that are carrying the logic that make water go or power go. But what they are doing is providing the screens that the operators and engineers use to make sure the system's running safely. You lose those, you don't know if your operator or your consumer is going to get hurt or die, and you have to shut things down. So ransomware and commodity malware actually have a really big impact on these industrial environments. And because some of them are very old Windows, sometimes a very strange impact because a virus can do something like fill up memory or fill up a hard drive. So weird impacts and very real life impacts because they impact the overall process. So that's a thing that we're constantly responding to, unfortunately. And adversaries are getting smart about that. They're less defended environments, and they are they tend to be something that people will pay up for if they can't get it to work. They need it to run tomorrow. Now, the second bucket, that is insiders. So nobody can cause more damage to an industrial process than the people who work on it every day. So somebody who's malicious, doesn't get a raise, doesn't get hired on, etc., can do a lot of damage to a process, especially, again, because they're less defended, they're more vulnerable. So that does happen. But there's also the unintentional insiders, too. There's the people who just want to watch Netflix because they're on third shift and they're bored and they just want to plug in something to the internet so they can watch a TV show. So we deal with a lot of that as well. And then finally, there's the advanced groups. There's the state-style adversaries. And the state-style adversaries are mostly doing foothold building and reconnaissance to do stuff later. And unfortunately, that doesn't build security budgets. That's them learning about how devices are set up and how environments are set up and what safety controls are in place. So if they want to do something geopolitically in a year or 10 years, they know how to do it. So we're dealing with all those.
So what is Lesley's general take on taking down an electrical grid as a possibility? Is that very realistic or not?
I actually teach a whole class on this for SANS, and it's really an interesting thing to think about and talk about. So first of all, for the average listener, the thing you need to understand is the United States grid is an amazing patchwork of stuff. So it's actually astounding to me every day that it actually works. It actually keeps running as much as it does. We have 3 grids. We have between Texas and East and West. We have 3 fairly discrete grids in the United States, and each of those is made up of numerous transmission and distribution and generation operators that are all operating in different topologies and with different technologies, and they manage to work together. So if somebody who wants to take down the grid has to be very, very smart in what they're going to target and which piece of that they're going to target to cause the most damage possible. It's not as simple as, we're not a European country that has one government managed grid. We have this patchwork, and you would have to target a specific piece of it to cause a major impact. Granted, we have big cities, we have big regional power networks, and you could cause a major impact. Now, I will add one thing to that. We always think about power. And I think psychologically and anthropologically, I can explain why that is. It's because it's the only thing we're used to seeing fail. Everybody who thinks about industrial cyber attacks talks about power going out. But in our society, in the modernized world, in America, in Europe, we are pretty lucky to have clean drinking water that's mostly reliable, sewage that doesn't fail. That's not true in other places in the world necessarily, but we know what it looks like when the power goes out. So when we have these conversations legislatively and from a technical perspective and on the media about industrial cyber attacks, we always come back to power because that's the thing that comes to mind. We know what that looks like. We can relate to it. but there's a lot scarier things like undrinkable water and sewage that doesn't work.
I'll move on from the Hollywood threats and focus more on the forensic stuff, because that's a lot more interesting. Digital forensics has been something I've been interested in for many years. In fact, I have a copy of Forensic Discovery by Dan Farmer and Wetzi Venema on my bookshelf right now. They covered the classic digital discovery methods on hard drives with operating systems. So how is it different in an ICS environment than, say, a network environment?
Incident response and forensics are totally different in industrial, and anybody who tells you otherwise is trying to sell you something. It really is vastly different from the people I have to hire, how I train them, the technologies that we use, and how we approach the problems. Let's start with consequences. Everything in OT comes down to consequences. If you are in cybersecurity doing security for OT and you're not thinking about process and consequences all the time in your conversations, you're doing it wrong. You're not going to accomplish your goal. The most important thing in a kinetic thing, like an OT process, power, oil and gas, manufacturing, is things being done safely without somebody dying or being injured or the facility catching on fire. These are real physical things that can happen to people. And so all of our cybersecurity actions, whether that's incident response and forensics or just building security controls, has to be built with that in mind. We cannot cause worse consequences than the bad guys. So when I do forensics, I constantly have to think about, hey, if I use this tool, could it have a process impact? Could it do worse than the piece of malware? Maybe there's a piece of malware infecting that entire OT network, and it's been there for 5 years. But I know from the fact that it's been there 5 years and from what it does that it's not going to cause a consequence of concern. But if I want to go remove it, me, the NITO cybersecurity person, okie dokie, I'm going to have to shut down the entire network for a week, and that's lost production for an entire week, and that's a worse consequence than just leaving the malware there. So I always have to think in those contexts. It's not cybersecurity in a vacuum anymore. And if you want to work in the space, you have to think about consequences first, your consequences and the adversary's consequences. And then in terms of tooling, well, we got the legacy stuff. So you got to get back in your Doctor Who TARDIS and go back to 2000 and do legacy forensics on these devices. You've got to pull out your toolbox for Windows NT and Windows 2000 and Linux of those eras, certainly. And then, you've got to be able to manage the memory constraints and the interface constraints. I have a soldering iron on my Go bag to build custom connectors. And then finally, there is the set of industrial devices that don't run anything familiar. They're running custom or vendor firmware, and maybe it's documented, maybe it's not. And it's a matter of what can you get out of these devices. So it's a lot of trial and error and reverse engineering to see if there's logging, see if there's diagnostics, and what we can potentially get from them.
I'm thinking about the skill that's required here. It's huge. You have to be an archivist. You have to know a little bit about everything that's gone before or how to find it, as well as everything that's out there right now, today.
I tell young people who want to get into this field, it's like an episode of How Stuff Works every day, and I love it. You have to love that. You have to want to go learn how eggs are packaged, and then learn how fertilizer is made and how nuclear power is generated. You don't have to be an electrical engineer or a chemical engineer. You need to know enough to be dangerous and ask the right people the right questions. And, there are experts that I call in all the time. There's experts in various vendor technologies, experts in electrical engineering and chemical engineering. And we use that expertise as a combined group to figure out these problems. It's not one person. It's just like cybersecurity. You're never going to know every niche of cybersecurity. I'm sorry. It's just not going to happen. Nobody can do that. You have to pick and choose. And it's the same. Industrial is just as big of a space. You have to pick and choose. And you have to know who to go to because you're never going to be an expert at everything.
So let's break this apart a little bit. We'll talk about Windows for a moment. There's been forensics done on Windows NT systems for networks. How might that work, and how might that be different in an OT environment?
We still do a lot of network forensics. Network forensics is the be-all, end-all in a lot of cases in industrial environments. First of all, because there's so little logging. There's so little SIM, so little XDR, so little centralized security tooling in these industrial environments. So network detection, network threat detection, and network monitoring really plays a crucial part, because you can put something on the network on a span port or a tap, and it's picking stuff up, and it's not, again, causing those consequences of concern. those consequences of potentially bogging down a really old system, interfering with a vendor warranty. Maybe you can't install or run anything on these systems. So we do a lot of that, and it's a lot of familiar tooling in a lot of cases. We're still analyzing packets, taking them apart like we did in 2000. We have to go back to those things. Now, we were able to do them before. We're able to do them much more efficiently now. We can do a lot more interesting things with packet analysis than we could in 2010 today. But in some ways, we have to change our methodology back to the old school stuff. And that's hard to train young people just coming out of college or coming out of test school to do, because they are so used to using, GUI automated tooling today, XDR, things like that. And that just doesn't exist in these industrial environments. You have to get a lot more creative.
Lesley mentioned log files, and they're not always available. So in cases like that, how might she go about piecing together what really happened?
Okay, so there's two elements of that. The first thing is, the first time I come into a case, when I get called in the middle of the night and somebody's having a catastrophe, my question is, what do you need from me? Because again, consequences. Sometimes the answer is, if we're not up and running in 2 hours, we're going to go out of business because we're losing $16 million an hour. So give me what you can in 2 hours. That's very different forensics than going into a ransomware case in an enterprise environment. That's like duct tape and string, bubble gum. What can I figure out in 2 hours to tell this company the best thing I can advise for how they're going to get up and running again? So that's one element of it. But the other element of it is, sometimes you can't get a good answer. That's the unfortunate thing in an industrial environment. If there's no pre-existing logging, if they haven't implemented any kind of centralized logging, if their logs on their Windows hosts roll over every couple of weeks, I can't do magic. I wish I had a magic wand and I could just wave it and give people an answer. And they're always, people are in tears. It's a catastrophe when their industrial environments are taken down by an adversary. And they want me to come in and magically fix everything, but they haven't done any preparation. They haven't installed any security tooling. They don't have any logging. They haven't gotten a retainer previously. And they want me to just fix everything. And I can't always do that. There's not always an answer. Sometimes it's just, I'll do a threat hunt and see if I see any signs of activity now. Let's see if the person's still there. And then let's see what we can do going forward. Let's look at your architecture. Let's try to batten the hatches down. Let's try to keep this from happening again and just move forward from there, because there's just nothing left. Windows NT host, that memory space is gone real fast. Probably got restarted when they were trying to troubleshoot the system. Windows event logging, very minimal on those older systems. It's just gone. I can do very detailed hard drive forensics, but on those older hosts, there's just not a lot left. So I do what I can. And then we try to move forward with the best recommendations possible.
So with incident response, I think of it as you get a call late at night and you've got your go-to bag and you get on a plane and you arrive and you take apart the system that's there. That's true with Lesley as well. However, with critical infrastructure, there's this very narrow window for the systems to be back up and running, whether it's a manufacturing site that's going to lose profits or it's human lives that could be in danger if the electrical or water systems stay down. Yet what I hear from Lesley is that it's somewhat like customer support, and she's talking them through as much as she can on that initial phone call. She's asking questions like, well, is it plugged in? Are the lights on? And all the while, she's thinking about how she's going to get the system back up and running. The forensics, that can wait.
It's a little bit of everything. I have a sign on my desk that my coworker gifted me that says marriage counselor. So sometimes it's just calming people down and getting the OT and the enterprise cybersecurity people to talk to one another because they hate one another. Sometimes it's dealing with crisis management. Sometimes it's forensics, very detailed forensics. Sometimes it's analysis of industrial logs, looking at historian data to figure out what's happened to the process. And it's a lot of pulling the pieces together to, again, mitigate the consequence of concern. The consequences usually are manufacturing is down, or we're scared one of our operators in our steel mill is going to be injured by molten metal. Those are serious things. So let's try to make some hypotheses and see if we can falsify those hypotheses, prove that the environment's safe to operate, and move forward. So it's case by case. I come in there and I never know what to expect, what they're going to need. It's always going to be something different. They're always going to have different needs, and it's always going to be a different situation.
Speaking of that, Lesley has numerous talks about her work. Is there one story that she can walk through as an example of what was memorable to her or representative of what she typically sees?
My favorite story is one where it wasn't cyber at all. I was called out in the middle of the night, and I'm one of the people who answers our phone when people have a crisis, and person's on the phone, absolutely frantic. And it's like, China's hacking us. You've got to come here right now. And I'm like, okay, tell me what's going on. Well, our power plant just turned on by itself. Okay, tell me a little bit more. Well, it's XYZ manufacturing power plant, and it's our peaker plant. And peaker plants are the power plants that go on in temperate climates in the summertime when the air conditioners go on. So you have more load, you need more generation. So you turn on these power plants, but it's a dead of winter in the Midwest. So they're like, it's XYZ system, and it just turned on by itself. And I'm like, okay, I'm on my way. I'm getting in my car right now. Pack up my stuff, get my go bag. And I'm talking to the experts on this system at Dragos on my way there. And, they're like, this might be the big one. Like, this is really strange. Like, the vendors troubleshot the system. They already went out and looked at it. They don't see anything wrong. There's no maintenance issues. The system was issued a command to turn on, and it went on. And it's like a 12-button sequence you have to hit to make this plant start up. Like, it's not just like, oh, I bumped my forehead into the keyboard. Like, so I get out there, and there's like 3 people in this power generation facility in the middle of nowhere. And it is a security guard and the 2 people on the skeleton crew. And the 2 people on the skeleton crew are like swearing up and down, it wasn't me, it wasn't me, it wasn't me. And they've been there forever, and they're looking at each other, and they're like, we were like talking to each other, looking at one another, and neither of us touched a keyboard. So they're vouching for one another. The security guard has checked all of the cameras. Nobody's gone in or out. It's very well physically secured. And so I spend the day doing forensics on their computers, and I find nothing. It's almost air-gapped. They're pristine Windows computers. There's no malware. There's been no remote connections to them. There's no remote access. Really nothing that causes any indication of concern. And so I eliminate those, and I'm like, where else can you turn this thing on? You can go out to the generation unit and you can manually turn it on, but there's cameras on that. And that didn't happen. And they're like, well, there's one more computer out in the shed next to it that can turn it on. I'm like, okay, well, good, let's go out there. We'll put on our PPE. We get in the truck in the snow. We go out there, and it's like one of those halfway climate-controlled outdoor sheds, like a Home Depot shed. And so we go in there, and the guy's looking at it. He's like, this is a computer that got hacked. I'm like, okay, show me. So in the shed, there's 2 racks of computers. The first one's the PLCs, so the ruggedized computers that operate the generation. Second rack is one of those rack-mounted computers that they can use to control it. It's like a copy of the ones they have in their office. And it's a normal rack-mounted computer, pull-out keyboard and a mouse and a touchscreen like mounted to the rack. And on that screen, every single Windows application is open. Notepad's open, calculator is open, MSTC, the RDP application is open. Everything is open on it. And this is not the movie Hackers. Like, there's no reason somebody's going to do this. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm like, no, this just doesn't, I'm not feeling it. I'm just not feeling it. You have the detective gut. Like, no. But I do my job. I still do my good investigation job, and I take a look at this computer, and I find nothing. Nothing. It looks pristine, but everything's open on it. And I'm like, well, that's kind of weird. Well, something hit this screen and hit the buttons to turn on the generation controls. So what was it? So there's some input devices on it, right? So there's a keyboard and a mouse and a touchscreen. So call my coworker, tell him to go to Best Buy, buy the keyboard and the mouse model, and stick him in his freezer. So let's get him wet. Let's stick him in the freezer and see what it does. But it doesn't do quite the right weird thing. So he does that. He goes out and buys them. We test it, and no, not quite the right thing, just kind of dies. And then there's this touchscreen. So I pull a hair off my head, and it's like really sensitive. And I'm like, I grew up on a farm. It is a dead of winter in the middle of the Midwest in a semi-enclosed shed, and there's this really bright screen. It's really sensitive, and it's always on. Huh. So for those of us who have lived in places like that, I tell him, I can't figure out how to test it. I'm like thinking about this for a minute. I'm like, open up Paint and leave it on the screen, full screen all night. And then take a picture on your phone and show me in the morning. And sure enough, 7 a.m. the next morning, he sends me a picture from his iPhone. There's little whirly gigs all over the screen. there had been bugs landing on this screen. And it's probably like 10,000 monkeys at 10,000 keyboards. They were probably doing it for years. And eventually they hit the right sequence of buttons to turn on the power plant. So to get out of that, I didn't like go in there, and I wasn't sure like Holmes. I didn't just point at it and I was like, moths on the screen. Like I did a full day's work of hard work forensics and analyzed what was going on the screen, looked at the remote connections, looked at when those windows were open. I eliminated everything else. And then what I was left with, which is often the case in industrial, was the weird, which was also plausible, however implausible, but that's what happened in that case. So that's the kind of weird stuff, the thinking outside the box we have to do in industrial computing, because it can be anything from human error to maintenance problems to cybersecurity to the most advanced adversaries in the world of the United States. Or bugs, or moths.
So how does one become Lesley Carthart? What was her path into this area of security? Because there are a lot of areas of security. So how does one fall into it?
I started programming when I was a little kid, back when you could do that. And I got my first job as a programmer when I was 15 or so. And I always was fascinated, though, by how things worked. And I kind of ended up in this non-standard space. I joined the Air Force, and they made me a back shop aircraft component soldering technician. And so I was fixing aircraft computers as a teenager and young adult. And, I moved on. I worked for telecoms. I did some knock work. And I eventually went to Motorola, and I worked at Motorola doing manufacturing cybersecurity for about 10 years. And so I've always been in that kind of non-standard computing space. And not only do I like the chaos of being an incident responder and forensic analyst and working on these cases, I love learning how stuff works in the world. And I think it's so important to understand how the things around us work, how they operate, how they function, especially critical infrastructure. And I enjoy every day going to work and having the opportunity to always learn about something new and something I didn't think about that's a critical part of our society.
So unlike with networks, there's a real-world impact with OT. So you're not only looking for what's happening on the computer system, but what's happening in the real world around it as well.
Yeah, it always matters. It wasn't a hard sell for me to join Dragos. It was, this is a real, meaningful, real life thing. Safeguarding civilization. Hey, that's a mission I can get behind. I never have any ethical concerns about what I'm doing when I wake up every day. It doesn't matter if I like a company or not. If their industrial systems get tampered with, it's going to hurt somebody. It's going to hurt the consumer. It's going to hurt the environment. And I don't want that to happen. So every day I know what I'm doing is a mission, and it's fascinating work, and it really matters. And I can't imagine doing anything else.
I'm wondering what Lesley thinks might be the reason that OT doesn't get as much love as some of the other areas of security today.
There's been a bad culture around OT cybersecurity for a really long time, and there's a lot of hostility between OT engineers and operators and cybersecurity practitioners because, as I've mentioned across this interview, dealing with cybersecurity has to be very, very different in these environments. Everything has to come back to those consequences. They are king in these environments. And for a long time, as cybersecurity practitioners, all that mattered was audits and patches. And for ages, we were telling those industrial environments, hey, patch your PLC or update the operating system on that oscilloscope. And you can't do that for the most part in these OT environments. You have to think of other creative solutions. You have to build bastions and secure architecture around these sensitive systems because they can't necessarily be upgraded. So there was a mix of us telling them to do the wrong things and not giving them workable solutions so they didn't want to deal with us, and also thinking that these were made of glass, these environments were made of glass, and we couldn't touch them at all. So I know a lot of organizations that I'm dealing with now, for ages, they just ignored those environments because they were like, well, they're air-gapped. Well, they're not air-gapped. They're never air-gapped. Air-gapping is basically a lie. Air-gapping usually means we have a 15-year-old firewall that has an allow any rule in it somewhere. And yes, it's a separate network range, but that's about it. And people need to start thinking about these as real, influential parts of their cybersecurity portfolio that have to be dealt with in a very, very different way.
What about the Band-Aid approach with OT, the security controls and so forth? Does that get you pretty far, or does it not?
It does. It does. So there's a white paper that I recommend everybody reads called The 5 Critical Controls for Industrial Cybersecurity. It's through SANS. And I very wholeheartedly agree with the controls that they list in this paper. It's not a sales pitch. It's very real. If people were able to implement some of these controls, these basic fundamental controls, it would reduce so many of the incidents I'm seeing, because especially the commodity stuff, like the adversaries have a price point. And if you become too hard of a target, they're going to move on to somebody else. So these critical controls are like secure architecture, like build strong boundaries, like crispy candy outside to the squishy candy center. So build secure architecture, and then have an incident response plan for your OT environment. Who are you going to call? Do you have a retainer? How are you going to deal with forensics in these environments? So you're not dealing with a crisis in hour 0, when you have an incident. And then things like secure remote access. I'm still dealing with tons of cases where there was no multi-factor on VPN. And sometimes these cases, I see 5 different remote access methods into one OT environment. They've been piled on for years. So those fundamental controls, just even like one of the other ones is secure monitoring, like security monitoring, like being able to see what's going on in your environment. And if you've had an incident, do some forensics. I know those are really, really fundamental things. They're really, really basic things, but they aren't happening in a lot of OT environments because they're behind. And that's okay. Everybody has challenges with this. But if people were able to implement some of these, my case base would be very, very different. My pen test team gets angry sometimes because our cases seem so boring to them. They want something novel and new, but people are still just exploiting VPN that doesn't have any multi-factor on it. And they're exploiting environments where there's zero security monitoring, or the security monitoring is in place and nobody's watching it. So unfortunately, it's that simple, but it's not simple to do.
It must be frustrating for Lesley to see very similar situations arise from time to time.
It makes me sad. I have a lot of empathy for these organizations, and they're always in crisis, and it's always somebody's job on the line, and it's horrible. It's maybe a company in the line if they have lost production. It's horrible. Of course it's awful. Utilities going down, that impacts direct consumers. So yes, of course it matters to me, and I'm sad, but I also know that it's very hard to do those things in industrial environments. We're playing catch up. We're 15 years behind in industrial cybersecurity, and that's everybody. That's small organizations, big organizations. I don't want to make it sound like any of this is easy. It's hard to do, and it takes investment. It takes effort. So yeah, I know it's hard, and it makes me very sad when those things are exploited to gain access to environments and do bad things.
So in industrial spaces, I know there are different models out there, like the Purdue model and so forth. You've got your traditional networking and business applications on the top, and then you've got the PLCs down below. But the OT attacks, they're still playing out that higher level, the networking and business apps. Or are we at a point now where we're starting to get serious and see them going all the way down to the lower PLCs?
When I said that my pen test team gets kind of bored with the incidents we respond to, adversaries take the path of least resistance. I often tell my classes my rule number 1 is hackers are lazy, but human beings are lazy. Maybe we're just efficient. If the hacker doesn't need to do an elaborate layer 0 attack against your industrial network, they are not going to do an elaborate Stuxnet attack against your environment. They are not going to do that. They are going to come through the exposed box on Shodan that's running Windows XP in your environment. Close the simple things first. Don't invest your time in chasing fantastical attacks that are theoretical that universities are looking at. Close the simple stuff first. Again, those 5 critical controls. Get a handle on that, and then we can start talking about, will adversaries move to that stuff when they need to? Absolutely. If they want to expend enough resources to get into a really high-value target, they will get in. And they might use a lower-level attack to do that. They might compromise firmware. They might compromise a physical device. Absolutely. Do they need to do that for the bulk of attacks that I'm seeing every single day? No. They're still coming in through the basic stuff because that stuff is hard to control and people haven't done it yet. So I would encourage practitioners to worry less about things that are coming over, the lights, the LED lights in the room, and hard drive noises and, disk drive noises and things that we see in those theoretical attack chains and, the layer 0 PLC attacks. And think more about, do I have exposed devices on Shodan? Do I have unpatched Windows systems that are facing my DMZ? Do I have a strongly controlled DMZ? Do I have multi-factor? Start with that, and then we can move on. Then we can have those conversations.
So does it help or hurt that CISA has been calling attention to OT?
CISA is wonderful. I respect what they're doing so much, and they are providing resources to like municipal utilities that were never there before. But they have limits to what they can provide, to their funding, to their personnel. They're doing what they can. And I definitely encourage smaller utilities, municipal utilities, to leverage every resource CISA has to offer, certainly. It's a wonderful tool to use, but understand, again, they have to triage. Things are bad out there. So, no, I have great respect for what they're doing, and it's a huge positive impact on the industrial cybersecurity space.
So I want to shift gears a bit. Lesley is also the creator of something known as PancakeCon. I believe the conference came up as an online event during COVID. I asked her if this was something she feels she'll continue to do, or is it just on a year-by-year basis? And the most recent one?
It was number 5, so I guess I'm doing it now. If I had known it was going to be number 5, I would have named it something less silly.
But it's your brand.
I guess. I didn't intend to have a brand either. It's really funny, but I do like what we're doing and what we're accomplishing. It's a free conference. It's online, so I try to make it accessible to people who are maybe immune compromised, can't go to conferences, or they live somewhere very remote, or they don't have the budget to travel. And what we do, which I think is important and I will stand behind in the future, is we require our speakers to talk about 2 different topics in each one of their talks. So the first topic is a junior cybersecurity topic, so something educational. And the second one has to be unrelated to IT. It has to be a hobby of some sort. And I do that for a reason. It's not just because, I'm a nerd and I want to learn about everything. It is, but it's also for work-life balance and mental health. I see a lot of young people in cybersecurity, especially with the economy how it is and the job market how it is, dedicating their entire waking life to just the hustle of cybersecurity. And I understand that. I appreciate that you have to hustle and get a job and things, but your health and your family and doing things that keep you alive and healthy and mentally well is so important. That's more important than any company you'll ever work for. So I want to encourage young people to see seasoned practitioners who have hobbies and interests in music and in food and in fitness and crafts and art outside of cybersecurity so that they know that's okay. And they get a little mental break from the learning and from the hustle so that they can do something else.
The conference also gives security experts a unique 360. I mean, they're human as well. I think the Elliot Alderson model is out there, and I go to conferences and I look around the room and it's like, no, these are ordinary people. And they're just people focused on security, which is awesome. And additionally, PancakeCon. They bring people in from the outside to the security world to start practicing security. How does Lesley feel about that?
We need that diversity so much. We have so many challenges. Like, look at OT. Like, we need people who have had experience working on oil pipelines and people who have built widgets and been mechanical engineers. We need those people to do successful OT cybersecurity. We need those in one niche of security. Across cybersecurity, we have so many problems. And a lot of them are very human problems. They have to do with privacy and how we handle data and how the next generation's data is used and tracking of people, physical tracking of people and their cars, medical devices, and things that we're going to put into our bodies that can potentially connect to a computer network. Those are complicated problems, and you can't just take one cookie-cutter template of a person and have them solve those effectively. They have to deal with people who have different educational backgrounds, different economic backgrounds. They're from different geographies, different ethnicities. All those things matter. They help us do cybersecurity better.
Bottom line, Lesley is passionate about protecting devices in industrial spaces.
I would suggest that everybody be more cognizant about the industrial devices around them. Give some thought to what's even in the building you're standing in right now. Right now, as we do this interview, we're sitting in Moscone Center in San Francisco, huge convention center, which is full of industrial devices that are providing the power and the lights and the water, the heating and cooling. And again, we don't notice them because they're all working properly right now, as far as I can tell. And you need to start thinking about those things as a cybersecurity practitioner, because I went and I gave a talk last week to a group of senior level executive cybersecurity people. And I asked them how many of them were responsible for OT systems. And 2 people in the room raised their hands. And I guess I was a bit blunt. And my immediate response was, no, all of you are. Pretty much all of you are responsible for OT systems. And that's very concerning because you're obviously not thinking about them. They might just be your HVAC systems or your power generators. Or your heating and cooling for your buildings. But those do critical things. Want to see what happens to a data center when it loses its air conditioner in the middle of summer? Bad things happen. So, yeah, you got to be thinking about that stuff.
I'd really like to thank Lesley Carthart for coming on the show and talking about her experience with IoT and OT incident response and forensics. As I said, I'm in awe at the level of experience necessary to perform at her level. Being able to muster solutions from 20 years ago, as well as juggle the needs of today's technology, as well as taking into consideration those real-world aspects, not just the environment where the devices live, but the consequences if those devices stay down. Lesley is unique as a role model, and hopefully others will follow in her footsteps. This job, it's too important to be ignored. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. Join us on Discord. Search for Error Code Podcast to join the server, or go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. I have more conversations coming up, including microsegmentation with IoT and OT devices. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.